Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, guest speakers, invited guests, colleagues, friends. My name is Dejans. I am the director of this Orpheus Institute, and it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome all of you at the Orpheus Institute. And also a warm welcome to those that are following us, joining us via streaming in the next 2 days. I said welcome at the Orpheus Institute, but actually we do find ourselves today not in the main building. We find ourselves here and will host for the very first time a large public event around the recently acquired collection of Tom Koopman in this recently renovated historic building, which is the coach house of the Baroque city palace Dames Steenhuizen next door, as is also the main building of the Orpheus Institute at the other side, next door. This wonderful and large collection of books and manuscripts and scrolls moved from the north of the Netherlands, a little bit more south, to the city of Ghent about 2 years ago, thanks to the generous sponsorship of the École Foundation. And since then, due to COVID, this collection has had to go into a kind of hibernation, at least for the outside world, because inside the house it was buzzing with activities. And you will be convinced of this later when Bruno Forment, the convener of this conference and the principal investigator of the research group around this collection, together with his fantastic team members, will lead you into the breathtaking world of manuscripts and scrolls and books. The Orpheus Institute has a focus on artistic research, and that implies that there is a kind of, say, natural, par excellence, a natural focus on artistic material. And there are indeed many forms of artistic material. But these days we focus on examining the relationship between musical performance practices and or with texts of various kinds. Performing by the book. Performing by the book? There must be a reason why the title of this conference ends in a question mark. And to find out more, that is exactly why we are here today and tomorrow. I wish you a very inspiring conference and a pleasant stay in our city, Ghent. Thank you very much.
Good morning, dear attendees, both in this room as on our YouTube channel. Allow me to join our director in saluting you at the very first conference organized by the Resounding Libraries cluster, of whom there are many members around. How glad I am to see this event happen at last. After months of anticipation, postponing, waiting, doubting whether we would ever have live events again, we didn't know. As Peter just said, the collection arrived in July 2020, so that was in the midst of hell, let's say. Some things were already delayed. The finishing of the cupboards was one of the first delays we got because of COVID and so on. But here we are with I find an exquisite lineup of speakers from 13 countries. There are even more people who are attending here. And they're assembled in this freshly remodeled coach house of Hotel Dames Steenhuizen. And of course, you're surrounded by this unique library. And we happen to have the collector himself, Mr. Tom Koopman, here present. And how fantastic it is that at the end of this day, he will also present a talk and tell us a little bit about his great passion and his heart, which he left here in Ghent, but is revisiting very, very often. Very great pleasure to have you all here in our midst. Before kicking off, I would like to express some thoughts on the central topic of this colloquium. And that's, of course, the intriguing relationship between musicians and texts, according to the broadest sense of the term, because text is every signal-based, symbol-based kind of expression. Anything that can be written down or scripted, that according to the new semiotic way of thinking about what texts are. And allow me to start with a little anecdote. As if it were yesterday, I remember how, as a little boy, my piano teacher handed over the title and the publisher's name of the first, I think, important score that I was to play and that was to reside on my piano desk for quite some time. Of course, the Notenbüchlein für Anna Magdalena Bach, Henle Verlag. I still have it in script there. And this is it. What an indelible impression that volume made upon a 9-year-old. I recall that while thumbing through it, and I did very often, I was confronted with unfathomable things at that time, such as the table of ornaments, for example, or the editorial remarks. What are they good for? And then, of course, that mysterious word on the cover saying Urtext. Filled with pride, I returned to the Music Academy to hand over the dark bluish-gray volume to my teacher. And then, what consternation. First, she picked the score and she played the first piece. I think it was a G minor minuet by Petzold, in hindsight, not by Bach himself. She played it to me and then she asked, "Do you like it for the first piece?" I said, "Yes." And then what she did was, and that was the consternation, she began to spoil these pristine pages by penciling fingerings, dashes, dots above and even on the staffs. So far, my spotless urtext. No matter what I felt about my teacher's scribbles, fighting with the clean typography of Henle Verlag, I had to endure the same spectacle lesson upon lesson, with dozens of marks for dynamics, articulation, expression, adding up and turning my paper treasure into a palimpsest. Of course, I did not know that word back then, but let's call it now palimpsest. By the time my life as a pianist with the Notenbüchlein was being over, and then I think the little fugues came on with the inventions, the Henle Verlag Urtext of Notenbüchlein was no longer an Urtext, but her text, being the artistic and technical text of a piano teacher, written over a dead composer's text, and inscribed bodily into the performance of a young, beautiful interpreter. But I took my revenge. Many years later, I remember I found a magisterial rendering of a 3-part invention before an examination jury. I guess I was 14 something. Again, a heavily annotated Henle Urtext led at the basis of my performance. But I played it by heart and with my whole heart. And so impassioned I was that I took a different tempo on the exam and added, God forbid, lush pedaling and rubato. Right after the exam, my piano teacher came to see me. She congratulated me on the audition. It was magna cum laude, it was okay. But then she of course sanctioned my interpretation of Bach. That is not the way one plays Bach. I think at that time I should have upturned Wanda Landowska's saying, you tried to play Bach's music his way, well, I played it mine. But it didn't work that way. Had I known the history of HIP back then, I would not have felt so hurt and even resentful that day towards my teacher, but also to Bach for being so inhospitable to a young musician's creative aspirations. As a teenager, I still had to come to grips with that phenomenon called notated music and the plain truth that for these written compositions to become music, they need to be transmuted, undergoing transformation from a silent, symbolically coded prescription into sounding or resounding matter. Though performers are held responsible of that very transmutation, their efforts are not arbitrary in the least, and rather they are informed by a library of texts subtext, context, the nature of which is determined by the performer's artistic, but in my case also pedagogical aspirations. And one orientation has it that musicians should do without text and rely on auditive mimicry. Let us not forget that the performance and composition of even art music do not depend exclusively on musical literacy, as several traditions, historical, contemporary, Western, non-Western, tell us. Even in L'Art de toucher le clavecin, Couperin famously advised not to show the, quote, score to children until they have a certain quantity of pieces in their hands. Because it's almost impossible, Couperin writes, that while looking at their book, their fingers should not be disturbed and contorted, and that even the ornaments should not be altered. Besides, memory is formed much better by learning by heart, argued Couperin. In a similar vein, cellist Anna Bijlsma is recorded saying that, quote, I think the mastering of an instrument never goes through reading first and then playing, it goes through playing first and then reading, and having good colleagues, especially people who play other instruments, end quote. Both statements assume that the mimicry of an experienced musician's playing can stand in for the decryption of a score, but not at the cost of the musical text per se. The latter remains immanent, though transmuted by some kind of a ghostwriter, such as Couperin, the harpsichord player, Bijlsma's fellow musicians, or my piano teacher. A second orientation recognizes the omnipresence of the text. I once later had a piano teacher who believed in the sanctity of the text. He was really a text fascist. Everything that is not there, you do not play. But she, at the same time, she had us read biographies of composers, as almost to imply kind of Einfühlung, as if we would magically be inspired by the person while playing these notes. Well, I can say at the age of 18, it did not happen. The hipster, which is short now for a historically informed performer, does recognize the limitations of the transmitted musical code, luckily, knowing that certain scores represent shorthand. But in turning thin writing, as it's often called, into rich performances, they hinge on a lot of contextual information, literally texts that are juxtaposed or that hover over the musical score proper in order to inscribe individual artistry and the sounding result into a scholarly verifiable texture wordplay made up of evidence of all kinds. The last centuries have produced an army of contextual gold diggers, hunting for treatises and methods to lend an allure of intellectual artistic integrity to performances of music early and not so early. In his 1915 classic, The Interpretation of the Music of the 17th and 18th Centuries, revealed by contemporary evidence, Arnold Dolmetsch acknowledged, quote, to have both the German and the French versions of Quanz's Versuch in his library, as well as most of the other works quoted in these pages. And indeed, if I had not been the owner of these precious books, I could not have accomplished my work, for it is only by studying them again and again, at leisure for years, that the light has come to me. The reading possible at the public library is necessarily too superficial to assimilate the details of such an intricate subject, end quote. Dolmetsch's statement testifies to an ambition to transcend and even subvert current practice and knowledge through a deep, immersive reading of historical text, preferably from the antique page or the facsimile. And I think the Tom Coleman Library illustrates this desire at great length. There is indeed something happening if you have these old volumes and read them from the page and read them again. But there are limits to musical contextualization, one being comprehensiveness, quality, critical span of the so-called primary sources. There can be no doubt that the amount of documentation for certain contexts is substantially greater than for others. Witness French versus Italian Baroque music. Even Bill Fordham always said, for French tradition, you have a lot more than for Italian music. And to extrapolate information from the one context to the other is extremely perilous, needless to say, especially in repertoire sensible to regional, generic, and stylistic differences. A lot of different dialects there. Neither do I have to tell you that a lot of gradations can exist between sources, even from a particular place and time, in the amount of detail divulged by them, in the quality and accuracy of their divulgation, as well as their critical relevance for the period at hand. You cannot expect the lacunary diagrams of the Middle Ages and Renaissance to provide as many performative minutiae as, say, scores of 20th century new complexity. And neither can we expect all preceptors to confide every single trick of their trade to be always there or up to date. A lot of them are antiquated for their time. Some testimonies are, moreover, not up to the task of articulating insights with the competence necessary to convince modern-day practitioners. Already in 1686, Andreas Werkmeister complained about the, quote, 100 special rules that were merely prescribed for beginners, he wrote, and that according to him could be substituted with simpler foundations. Voltaire contended from his side that the arts of his day, 1726 that is, that they were awash in, quote, prodigious number of rules, most of which are useless or false. We still find lessons everywhere, but few examples. Nothing is easier, he said, than to speak in the tone of a master about things that cannot be executed. There are 100 poetics against one single poem. One sees only masters of eloquence, but almost not a single orator. That's quite a hard point. Not everything that shines in terms of primary sources or evidence has to be gold, alas. Still, HIP has witnessed a lot of idiosyncratic precepts become conventions for very big swaths of repertoire, much bigger than was originally meant. I think, for example, of continuo setup. For some reason, harpsichords and cello have become standard, although there's plenty of evidence saying there was much more variation there. Conversely, alternative options have been dismissed in light of their being not recorded by the one or the other piece of evidence. Besides, in our digital era, which has been dubbed Age of Abundance, the term is not mine, not the scarcity of texts is longer at stake. Rather, it is a lack of tools to navigate through a jungle of digitized materials available on the web. In a recent BBC podcast, digital humanities professors told how students tend to increasingly dismiss published critical editions in favor of online freebies, whatever they can find. And that can be totally unreliable modern editions prepared by amateurs on IMSLP, there are plenty of them, but also digitized early prints or manuscripts from world-class institutions, whom an earlier generation, mine, had little access to very often. Open science and open access may bring the golden era of the urtext to an end. We don't know, but we'll see. Together with that of the facsimile, the printed facsimile that is, and the commented critical edition. Whereas earlier generations encountered difficulties in locating a copy of a trustworthy score at the library within traveling distance, current generations have a hard time picking the right source from a plethora of available materials and in retrieving information from them. If something needs to be transmitted to young artists nowadays, it is the tools and skills to navigate their way through the information jungle. And just such a tool is the Tom Koopman collection and its unique asset. Thousands of handwritten indices the owner and user provided to the collection. Almost each volume contains a list of keywords, followed by page numbers referring to passages or collector found noteworthy. Written on separate slips of paper in the case of the old books, or directly into the front matter of modern exemplars, each index constitutes a knowledge map, translating textual, musical, iconographic context into concepts that are not only surprisingly consistent, but also comprehensible and usable for modern musicians. Some keywords are straightforward, topical terms, personal names, toponyms, but many others represent ongoing research questions. what to do with the fermata, in chorales, for example, how to configure and set up a choir or orchestra in a certain time. What about continual realization or overdubbing, and so on? Each of the linked passages in the sources represents but one possibility in the eyes of a certain author. When brought together into a master index, a database as we are doing, Tom Koopman's indices reveal a universe of what Leibniz used to call compossibilities, options for artistic practices that coexisted in a network of ideas and agents and which can newly coexist in the performed present. These indices do not only enable artists and scholars to dive into the primary sources much more easily, they can also help them articulate choices vis-à-vis the historical record in view of artistic inclinations or modern economic, acoustic, and receptive requisites. For every musician, HIP or not, must eventually negotiate with the historical record and speak with the dead. In his Discours de la méthode, René Descartes considered, quote, reading any good book to entail a kind of conversation with its author, and thus with the most outstanding people of the past. Yes, one might say a learned debate in which they share with us their best views, end quote. John Budd argued that HIP performers err when they consider their practice to be history, when it is really one of heritage that should be consequently demand imaginative rather than objective recreations of the past. But history itself constitutes a modern reenactment of a past experience, Collingwood showed long ago. Every formation of historical understanding entails a certain performance around the historical text and object, which must be rethought in the moment. Today and tomorrow, 17 artist researchers will critically reevaluate the relationship between their performance practice and texts of all kinds. In which ways are performative acts and attitudes shaped or reshaped by textual sources? Where do they situate the limits of textual interpretation, both in terms of the limit of interpretation itself, as the desirability to have it encroach upon autonomous, I hope, artistic choices? Since this topic, of course, transcends the boundaries of a certain period, you will hear case studies from the Middle Ages all the way to the 20th century. Now, before giving the floor to the first session, I need to communicate some housekeeping information. In terms of order, we'll always have the papers first, and then the Q&A and the discussion, which the speakers then are invited to join here and discuss. In this way, papers can follow one another quite smoothly, and questions can emerge quite slowly in the listeners. Lunches, dinner, coffee, like coffee this afternoon, will be served at Orpheus Institute's main building. That's Kortemeer number 12, up there in the street. The entire second day of the colloquium will also take place there. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., there's a surprise act, which I all invite you to attend. It's a surprise, even from my colleagues. And it's in the concert hall of the main building. You can visit the library throughout this day. Feel free to walk around. But we've foreseen a special moment for those who are interested in hearing more details about the organization, how we do it digitally, how we transform the keywords into a database, and that's foreseen at 1800 or 6 p.m. Feel free, if you rather take a refreshment, go ahead. As mentioned previously, it will not be possible to consult specific items from the library today or tomorrow, but we put on some exhibits from the old collections in the cupboards behind me. And I'm also very glad to announce that 251 manuscripts have just been digitized. And around the summer they will be made available for everyone via IIIF. And of course, you're always welcome to return here. Ghent happens to be not so far away from a lot of places. And we always invite you to come to work here on materials and to make us smarter than we are. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fantastic conference.
Niels. Yeah, I will very briefly. So we'll have the first session now, just with three speakers, which connect in a very interesting way. So we start with Niels Berentsen from the Haute école musique de Genève. Niels actually is a laureate from the doctoral program, so we're very happy to see you again here, now professor in Genève on music theory, and he will talk about his life in reimagining incomplete medieval music. Then the second, I present all the three because then you have the floor. Then Albin from Fordham University, New York, is a teacher for English and medieval studies. And Andrew will talk here is the manuscript as an instrument. It's also a very fascinating topic. And the third speaker, Björn Schmelzer, from graindelavoix. He's an anthropologist, a musicologist, but also an artistic director of this graindelavoix, which is a transdisciplinary performance ensemble. We'll talk about music that what is not written, reading what was never written. So the three talks relate in a very interesting way. What is not written, Bruno already mentioned some of these cases in the past. And without further ado, I just give the floor to Niels Berentsen, please.
Thank you for this nice introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Ghent. As was mentioned by Paulo, I did my doctorate here, so it feels a bit like returning to the nest. Without further ado, Mind the Gap, Reimagining Incomplete Medieval Music. Of course, medieval music is in some sense always incomplete. But my paper here concerns my dealing with a rather specific kind of incomplete medieval composition, one which is actually has holes in it. And there are my experiences not only as a scholar, as a musicologist, but also as a quote-unquote recomposer, as well as a singer and an ensemble director. To just take one example, let us look at the following piece. In Klein Parabel is a song in Dutch, which is ascribed to its composer Martinus Fabri in its unique source, the so-called Leiden fragments. The fragment contains an upper voice, a cantus, which is almost intact, and the part of a tenor which has the same text as the cantus. So it's a texted part, and it's already quite surprising for this era. As almost all pieces in this collection tend to be in three voices, we can safely make the presumption that it would also have contained a contratenor, a third part, as well as possible further texts, the residuum textualis. They are written in choir format, one below another, and the first strophe of the text actually presents us with a parable, a little story. The singer's vision of his lady carrying a small and adorable child, which is not his, and the pain and at the same time the warm feelings this arouses in him. I will return to that unresolved bit of metaphorical language later on, but so for now suffice it to say that as is typical for lectionary pieces, this song until recently only had a paper existence, and was left unperformed, unrecorded, and to a certain extent even ignored by scholarship. Reconstruction is a good way of making such pieces visible and audible. It enables scholars and performers to discuss the merits not only of the reconstruction itself, but also of the presumptive original, comparing it to complete pieces, and reinserting the lectionary piece into a corpus, an oeuvre, or even a whole style period. In this case, for instance, it may rekindle the debate started by Daniel Leeds Wilkinson about the character and the quality of Martinus Fabri's musical settings. More importantly, actually, it enables the lectionary piece to assume a life beyond the critical edition in performances and recordings. Yet, reconstructions are also problematic as sounding hypotheses, between quotation marks. They result from a balancing act between text critical scholarship on the one hand and musical creation at the other. How far can we go in reconstructing such pieces? And is reconstruction only really defensible if we are likely to get close to the lost original? Now, there can be various answers to this. My personal involvement with medieval music, incomplete medieval music, scholarly and artistic, has, besides the import and merits of these lectionary works, also been motivated by the challenge that is posed by the lacuna itself. More so than complete musical text, the incomplete work has a way of drawing the reader, and I will firstly speak about the reader, in. It invites them to reimagine a lost whole. The musical fragment, in other words, shares something with the ruin, or even with the consciously non-finito, in that it likewise requires an active, imaginative stance of the viewer in order to be interpreted at all. In the case of lectionary music, someone with a knowledge or the style and an aptitude for musical composition may strongly feel the temptation to step in the shoes of the medieval composer and to correct, so to speak, the iniquities of manuscript transmission. The argument I'll be putting forward here is that the act of reconstruction can, in and by itself, be seen as a valid way to explore the musical potential of incomplete compositions, enriching scholarship, as well as performance of medieval music. To give you an idea of what happens when one starts to reconstruct and perform an incomplete piece of medieval polyphony, I would like to return to that example of Martinus Fabrice's Een Klein Parabel, of which I produced a reconstruction for Discantores' recent album Hollandse Fragmenten, which came out in 2021. After this, I will offer an assessment of the nature of the lectionary work, so to speak, and the reconstruction effort, aided in part by the famous influential definition of the opera aperta, or open work, by Umberto Eco. Een Klein Parabel. Here we see the second stroke of the piece. I've produced an edition which actually has holes, where the holes or illegible bits of the original are. Now, some notes here are rather easily reimagined. In the first line, the word Vrouwenlien, we have a cadence to A. Similarly, at the end of the line, Eerdenrik, we have a cadence to G. And there's one more such little hole. These are very easily filled out. There is, of course, the whole missing third line, that of the contratenor. So for this, we have to imagine what kind of musical texture is going on here. So for the first line, when I observe the notes and I observe the setting of the text, how they interlock, I can be fairly sure that this is a homophonic setting in which the contratenor is replenishing, fully filling out the sonorities of the two principal parts. So I can make a fair supposition about what it would have looked like this. For the next bit, it's a bit more complicated. You can see a little bit of invitation at the unison between the two upper parts. And actually it turns out that the clue for what the missing part would have done is already there. There is an accompanying little tenor-like element that I can fill out also in the contratenor below, and choose a new homophonic section for which I can apply the same procedure. So am I sure there in the yellow bit I'm 90% sure. For the rest I can observe the spirit of the setting, perhaps not the actual notes, but I can come close. More interesting it becomes when also the second part, the tenor, drops out due to the page turn. Remember that the right hand page was lost, so I don't have about half of the tenor. And to make it even more interesting, the second phrase you see here that we thought to be read is om haar zo droeg ik grote smert, so there's also a few words that are missing. The cantus top part also has a gap that these become illegible to rub. Now, what's going on here? There is a big rest. This rest is really notated, so I can assume that perhaps there is an imitation game going on again between the upper parts. Here would have been the second statement of the canon, and I can compose a little canon. Of course, I don't know exactly what the notes would have been, but I know it is something like this. I have the beginning and the end of the phrase. I can copy and paste that with the text I also reconstructed into the tenor. I can fashion an accompanying tenor statement for the cadence. I'm pretty sure what it would look like. Insert that into the contratenor like this, so I almost already have a complete hypothesis. And then for the parts that you see at the beginning and end of the slide that are homophonic, I supply a homophonic setting. And like this, I can work through about 80% of the piece. Very interesting is the beginning also, because here there are conflicting hypotheses about how it could have looked like. This is what survives, more or less. Few notes are not so legible, but I can make a fair guess that it's like this. The one other piece in the Leiden fragments that has such a canonic opening, it starts in two voices with an accompanying contratenor. So it starts in two parts. There is no three-part imitation. Yet, it is possible to make a three-part imitation here. As you see here, there's two little imitative fragments here as well. And when I think like a good counterpoint student, I can make an imitation with the lower fifth. Now, this does exist in some pieces around 1400, notably in Zaccarat's Gloria and some Fior Gentile. So there are two principles of text critical scholarship. One, the statistical observation on the corpus you are studying, which would indicate the prevalence for one hypothesis, and the other is actually the famous Erasmian Lectio Difficilior, which says that the most difficult possibility for reconstructing the material must be the right one. In this case, I actually chose for the good old-fashioned Lectio Difficilior also because it sounds very nice, and I will let you listen to just the beginning of the track of our recording in the Haute Fragmenten album. Singing my own composition. It's quite a nice feeling. I would like to draw attention at the end of this small discussion of Een Klein Parabel to another thing that is lacking here, and that is the rest of the text. As I said, the song very self-consciously presents itself as a parable, and it on the surface looks like a love song. Yet it has some language that is a bit strange for a love song. For instance, already the phrase, where the hand is, there is the wound. Sounds a bit like stigmata. The lady is called the sweetest lady who ever walked the earth. She is carrying a small and lovely child. And then at the end, there is the thing that if the singer would continue doing as he is doing, he would revere the child for its mother's sake, which would not be a good thing to do. So in my opinion, this rather looks like a Marian text. It looks on the surface like a courtly love song, but it's actually about the Virgin Mary. Of course, we are lacking the rest of the text, so how can I communicate such a hypothesis? I could have very grossly provided a pastiche for the next verse, explaining in bold, no, this is about Virgin Mary, blah, blah, blah. I chose not to do that for the reason that it's slightly gross. And what we did instead in our concerts and also in our recording is to make a programming choice on what to put next that would maybe lead some listeners to thinking that this could be as well as a secular piece, also a sacred composition, and that is the next track, the next piece you perform, you would hear would be this. the solva regina. So in other words, what I would do is that I would provide a meta text inside the performance for a decoding of this incomplete metaphorical language. Stop for a bit of conclusion, scholarly and artistic, the lacuna and the open work. As we have seen in the foregoing, reconstruction can only very occasionally offer absolute certainty as to what the original would have liked. It is the reflected vision of one scholar, moi, on the most likely way a network of possibilities could have played out in the mind of the composer. However, for all its uncertainties, reconstruction produces invaluable insights in the way in which elements of musical style are combined and recombined in a particular repertoire. The lacunary piece thus becomes nested in a whole network of references, internal and external, to other musical texts, which may engender different, complementary, or contradictory interpretations about how it could be reconstructed. In other words, more than a finalized musical text, the reconstruction can be thought of as an interpretation or a mapping or navigation of a network of existing possibilities. In other words, it becomes a little like those 20th century pieces with an open or polyvalent structure like Karlheinz Stockhausen's Klavierstück 11 or Berrios' Flute Sequenza, which actually inspired Umberto Eco's definition of the open work. In fact, a number of elements from Eco's Poetics of the Open Work from 1989 are extremely useful for coming to grips with the problem of the lacunary text and its reconstruction. First, the kind of text Eco describes is not actually open in any absolute sense. It cannot be read just in any way. Various interpretations are, and I quote, the actualization of a series of consequences whose premises are firmly rooted in the original data provided by the author. In other words, valid interpretations of such a work have to operate within, and I quote again, the specific limits of a given taste or the predetermined formal tendency of the original. This implies a great amount of care on the part of the reader or the performer for that original material, and an acceptance of the constraints governing its form and style, a bit like what I'm doing when I'm trying to reconstruct these pieces in this spirit. I can attest from this experience that the process of close reading a fragmentary piece while going back and forth to several models and ways to figure out ways in which to complete it is about the most thorough and really caring way in which one can approach such a damaged musical composition. Second, what nevertheless justifies Eco in calling such text really open is the invitation the author extends to the reader to co-produce the work, or indeed, as Eco calls it, to complete it. In the case of the medieval lacunary piece, there has of course not been such an invitation in a literal sense. These works are incidentally rather than consciously open. However, I would argue that in the musical culture in which works are not, and I stress not, the absolute property of their authors, such an invitation may count as explicit. In the semi-oral culture of music making around 1400, musical compositions may be seen as particular instances and configurations of commonplace musical forms and material, which, if anyone's at all, are the collective property of a community of users, the composer, his fellow singers, a whole audience. In some small towns, people, like in my town, people keep their front doors unlocked. More importantly, if we realize that a true revival of medieval music, or any early music, in fact, needs to be a revival of skills and interpretive practices like those of ornamentation, the realization of unfigured basses, partimento, and improvised counterpoint on plain chant, not to forget, that go beyond the literal written musical text, we may also become more receptive to a concept of reconstruction as historically informed co-composition. Third, for Eco, the network of constraints set by the original data also ensures that the work, in its very essence, remains the same in different structural configurations, even if this happens to be in a way that the author himself or herself themselves did not exactly foresee. Reflecting once again on medieval compositional and improvisatory practices, we could state that the lost complete piece represented only one particular shape the composition could have taken, fixated by the composer and or by the scribe at a certain point. Hence, if we take the work between quotation marks to be more than the literal exact configuration of the lost word text, we can perhaps accept reconstructions to be faithful to the style or to the feel, to its sensus anagogicus, to borrow a term from Aquinas, rather than to its sensus literalis. Finally, there is a simultaneously definitive and provisional character of Eco's open work, which results from the fact that it needs to be enacted, and every time as the work itself, in every performance or reading, without, though, negating the validity of other performative possibilities. One can and must be convinced of the version one is performing without excluding the possibility for future different versions. Engaged in reconstructing a lacunary piece, we may often very much feel that we are right in realizing the canonic potential of the given material or some such things. But even the most convincing hypothesis is still a hypothesis whose verification must, if the occasion ever arises, lie in the discovery of the complete original. Until that day, ladies and gentlemen, the Lacuna offers a unique place for deeper understanding of and engagement with musical practices and artifacts of the past. As recomposition, reconstruction has a role to play in the revival of early music as a living practice, not only by giving performers new repertoire to perform and record, but also by furthering creative use of the musical idioms of the past by learning first to improvise, to write, and to compose in them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niels. It was really fantastic presenting. But now, for Albin, please. Is Andrew here?
That would be good.
Please keep your questions to the end.
Someone left.
Thank you. I wanted to start with a quick note of gratitude for inviting me to present some work. It's really lovely to be here. I'm a scholar in profession, not a performer, so it's really interesting to be in conversation with performers who are thinking about music practice. I'm also a literary scholar, so I'm a little bit outside of my world, but I work on sound studies, so there's points of connection. And already in the comments and papers that have been presented, I see lots of overlap, so I'm very excited for the conversation that could emerge. So to get into it. A number of years ago, around 2 in the afternoon, the first weekend in May, I was at home in a drafty one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of New York City, putting my domestic space in order. Though I'm resistant to its strict injunction, I'll admit to enjoying the act of putting things in order. There is a satisfaction in parsing out piles, in meeting again what once felt important enough to retain and realize it no longer is, in filing away papers and playbills for some possible future need, in feeling the energetic tugging demand that some stray book, worn blue cloth boards and foxed fibrous paper edge makes on my sorting body. The local radio station began to broadcast an afternoon program I can't bring myself to listen to. A long set of big band, vocal jazz, and the American songbook, the kind of music my grandfather grew up with, the kind he would suddenly start to sing as I conversed with his dementia. The echoes between my grandfather's fractured leaps and halts and the radio host's meandering commentary grew too discomfiting. I switched the program off and instead launched BBC Radio 3's streaming service to tune into the Sunday feature. My apartment filled with human burbles' warm accents, the conversation ignorable but present, an acousmatic proxy for the living texture of the social, a soundscape that would become all the more familiar during the isolations of a pandemic that I could, at that point, scarcely imagine. And then, a mildly affected, avuncular voice, whose name I didn't catch, insinuated in my ear, its collation of certain words snagging my attention. I wrote those words to myself on the edge of a postcard from a friend. Google's algorithms later matched those words to a short essay by the painter, novelist, and art critic John Berger, published in Harper's Magazine, titled Some Notes on Song, The Rhythms of Listening. I read the very words Berger read on the radio, the pace and timbre of his voice echoing in my head, which words I read for you now. A song, when being sung and played, acquires the body. And it does this by taking over and briefly possessing existent bodies. The body of a double bass, standing vertical, while it's being strummed. Or the body of a mouth organ, cupped in a pair of hands, hovering and pecking like a bird before the mouth. Again and again, it takes over the body of the singer. And after a while, the body of the circle of listeners, who, as they listen and gesture to the song, are remembering and foreseeing. In Some Notes on Song, Berger offers loose musings on the inner experience of the being and becoming of songs in time, often understanding that experience in dialogue with his artistic practice and drawing parallels with his study of visual culture in books like Ways of Seeing and About Looking, standard textbooks in the art history classroom. Berger is well respected for his efforts to dismantle cultural habits of seeing. He fragments the gaze and reassembles its pieces in the marginal spaces of exile and alienation from the interstices of word, theory, narrative, image, anecdote. I take him to be venturing a similar effort here. A song, when being sung and played, acquires a body, he says, and it does this by taking over and briefly possessing existent bodies. What kinds of bodies? Instrumental ones, double bass and harmonica to begin with. These bodies do not sing exactly. Their mouths lack the articulators and exhalations to produce the words of the song, but they are necessary for the becoming of the song, which becomes a capacious word in Berger's hands. Those instrumental bodies require the interactions of other human bodies. The belly of the double bass needs plucking fingers to emit its rumble. The mouth organ, cupped in protective human hands, pecks at a mouth that breathes and blows it into sound. A song acquires a body, one that spans and knits together multiple bodies, when its instruments touch one another to be drawn into use. This happens too to the human singer, whose body is taken over again and again by songs. The multiple iterations of the singer's singing body are strung together into a different kind of relation than is otherwise engendered by the customary persistence of the singer's corporeal bulk. His singing generates something more than his body, that spans and binds him, as it spans and binds his audience, whose listening and gesturing coordinates in such a way as to manifest a corporate body. For Berger, song incorporates, and the compound bodies it renders assemble animate and inanimate, human and mechanical, individual and collective elements into an ephemeral but real material existence. For Berger, the body of the song stretches backwards and forwards in history, reorganizing the coherence of time, activating memorial and vadic powers in the incorporate audience who, as they listen and gesture to the song, are remembering and foreseeing. I wonder about the necessity of music for Berger's song, whether the kinds of incorporations he describes can arise from the disruptions of a public announcement, the crack of a gunshot, the beloved voice suddenly in our ear again. I think of how my ordering body was halted by a speaking voice in air, how its routines fractured, I think of how my hand leapt to record that speaking voice on paper before Berger's words slipped from my memory. The broadcast continues. Now a woman's voice, Katja, Berger's daughter, takes up his words and propagates them into sound, a patrimony in language whose utterance means something different when it's a daughter who pronounces. I hear cars go by in the background. Berger and his daughter recorded this radio piece in his living room. I wonder about the manufacture of the table they sat at to record, whether spindly or sturdy-legged, the color of the cloth on the table beside the open window. I want to eavesdrop on what they say to each other between takes. She speaks of songs outside of bodies, of revenants, of conglomerations, of past, present, and future, in the space and time of utterance, of the song's persistent hope for an audience, which is to say, its hope for incorporation, for a body.
A song, as distinct from the bodies it takes over, is unfixed in time and place.
A song narrates a past experience.
When it is being sung, it fills the present. Stories do the same, but songs have another dimension which is uniquely theirs. A song whilst filling the present, hopes to reach a listening ear in some future
somewhere.
It leans forward, further and further. Without the persistence of this hope, songs, I believe, would not exist. Songs lean forward.
One way of understanding this passage dwells on the fixity of sound, on its emplacement in performance. A song unfixed in time and place isn't a song, Berger might be taken to say. To be, songs need to be sung. Songs, in other words, need bodies. Distinct from them, they become something other than song, the artifacts and archives of song. Music notation, printed scores, etched recordings, digital code. To my ear, Berger isn't interested in ghost songs. Rather, the song she describes is always now being sung, its temporal compass ever expanding. A song narrates a past experience. When it is being sung, it fills the present. While filling the present, it leans forward in the hopes of reaching a listening ear. The song that is being sung is thus always being sung again. Even when its verbs switch to the present tense, even when it notices the spooling out of its performance in our here and now, the song anticipated this moment of utterance. It brings its history of utterances with it into the sounding now. When the song incorporates a body out of the collected instruments at its present disposal, it doesn't stop desiring its audition past the moment of its performance. As it is being sung, it asks to be sung again. Ordering time under a different dispensation, it hopes to sustain its body, and it cares little whether we recognize the body it sustains as such. I am curious to understand the force this hope exerts on the materials from which song is constituted, across the temporalities and bodies song straddles. In the remarks that follow, I want to follow my hunch that music, as we usually understand the term, isn't what Berger's after here, just as the terms song and body signify in his essay something other than what they usually do. I also want to turn from Berger's incorporations towards materials that, though more chronologically remote, are closer to my areas of study. Late medieval manuscripts, traditionally quiet objects, that have long appealed to our scholarly and aesthetic eye, so often to the detriment of codices whose leaves fail to meet the canons of visual beauty. I want to suggest that the medieval manuscript, an assemblage of boards and glues and paints and hides, is more than an information technology or an art object, that in interaction with human bodies, it reveals itself to be a body that can incorporate. That at the same time, they narrate the past. Manuscripts lean forward, further and further, ever hopeful of reaching a listening ear in some future somewhere, in our future, here and now. I thus open an invitation today. We must play manuscripts. I mean this expansively, polymorphously, in all the ways we might play. We must play the manuscript like a musical instrument. We must play the manuscript like a tape deck. We must play the sound games the manuscript encodes. We must don the mask of persona the manuscript asks us to play and play on. This is, to be sure, an unusual invitation. It asks a certain leap of faith, a holding in abeyance of some allegiances, and a too close embrace of others. I ask your indulgence to play along as I play up the playability of that resonant object we call the manuscript. I believe we can begin to redress our critical misapprehension of the medieval manuscript in all of its vibrating materiality by aiming to realize the manuscript's native modes of play. The same takes shape around two propositions. First, that the manuscript was for the Middle Ages a machine that desired and that still desires its coming into sound, and second, that failing to play with that machine, failing to play into its desires and plug ourselves into the mechanisms of its operation, fundamentally misunderstands the manuscript's technology. I want to reverse engineer the manuscript. I want to take it in my hands and open it and fiddle with it and breathe in it and breathe with it and shuttle my voice through it and listen to the sounds we produce. Carefully, attentively, binaurally, one ear straining at the past, one ear pricked at the timbre of its, my, our voice, here and now. I want to sing duets with the codex, because this is how codices, I believe, were designed to work. To borrow a phrase from Don Ida's phenomenological study, Listening and Voice, I want to listen to, quote, the duet of things which lend each other a voice, so that I can hear what each offers in the presence of the other, end quote. I am interested in historicizing the technology of the book and the sensations that accumulated around it during the Middle Ages. I am interested in revivifying the experiences the manuscript was designed to produce. Writing before her politics turned outwardly repugnant, medievalist Rachel Fulton explains that, quote, it is not that these experiences themselves are radically inaccessible as such. Rather, we simply do not have the practice that would make them available to us. We are frustrated when we try to use books because we do not know how. And so we blame books for being unwieldy, or ironically, too mechanical, when it is we ourselves whom we should blame for being unskilled, end quote. I'm skeptical of our ability to become skilled to the degree Fulton longs for, but I'm also sympathetic to that longing. Sympathetic because I too long for it, and skeptical because we will, I think, never acquire the medieval book player's experience. With respect to the lived experience of others, especially historical others, we are, all of us, inexpert. The best we can do is look to the supports and traces of experience, and study them for the instructions and rules they encode, and play amid the constructions of experience they make possible. I'd like to return to the question of whether the mode of play I'm interested in exploring here is musical, whether we profit by considering it so, even if as an heuristic exercise. In a word, I believe it is, and I believe we do, though we need to push at the boundaries of the term music to understand why. Some might resist such a theoretical move as encroaching concept creep, but there are good justifications, I think, for pushing these boundaries for a sonorous Middle Ages. On the one hand, we have Boethius, the authoritative discursive initiator for all of medieval musica speculativa, who defines music as proportional relation equally expressed at the cosmic, human, and sonorous levels. Here, I catch echoes of the expanded notions of sound, space, time, and body Berger invites us to consider. On the other hand, compositional procedures and critical musicologies of recent decades have prompted us similarly to relax our gatekeeping around the term music. Christopher Small, for example, transforms the word from a noun to a verb in his well-known book, Musicking, in which he outlines a musicking process that encompasses the multiple people and activities affiliated with music's meaningful encounter as heard sound. In Music and Performance in the later Middle Ages, Elizabeth Randall Upton takes up Small's neologism and characterizes medieval musicking as a kind of game, a relay of sorts that passes musical play from composer to performer to audience over time. This is a game I want to play, so I'm compelled to push Upton's model further. In the music and game, as Upton describes it, each player plays under a proper set of constraints. The result of each player's play becomes a constraint for the next phase of play, such that all phases are linked one to the next in a cascade. Composers, constrained by the musical knowledges, practices, and pedagogies available to them, render musical compositions. Along with the material conditions that shape an ensemble and its venue, these compositions serve as the constraints for musicians, who render a performance in space and time. In turn, this performance, in concert with the culturated habits of listening, serves as the constraint for the audience, who render a meaningful audition, which might include learned interpretation, but also encompasses aesthetic pleasure, the social or occasional significance of a performance, the resonance of oral memories, and so on. Upton stops here, but I understand this game to extend further. A fourth phase of play, defined by its governing player, the scribe, is constrained by listeners' audition. Bookmakers do not waste their efforts recording oral experiences on expensive parchment unless some listener, if not the scribe himself, has found it meaningful. Finally, a fifth phase of play, that of the scholar who takes up the manuscript and interprets. Naturally, I have us in mind, but I'm also thinking of Boethius's musique, of those medieval and post-medieval thinkers and writers about music, who worked to make clear sense out of meaningful sounds, who constructed theories of how a musical composition works, of how it's assembled, of how it's experienced, of how and what it means. In this way, the model circles back on itself. We join in the music and game. Guido d'Arezzo and Hildegard and Jacques de Liège and Zarlino all become our playmates. Our scholarship is thus, or can thus, belong to the process of medieval musicking, and it can contribute substantially to the meaning-making of medieval sounds, but only when we play according to the rules of the musicking game, which we learn not from any instruction manual, but from the materials of the game directly: parchment, ink, breath, space, and the disturbance of air. So then, let's join in the game. Let's play. Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, MS 61 sits comfortably in the hand, its modern red leather binding enclosing 150 leaves of vellum. The heft of flesh presses skin into skin. The book opens, we turn the first page, the codex machine springs to life and immediately leans into sound, inviting us to play it into audibility. We're met with one of the best known images for scholars of Middle English literature, the frontispiece to Chaucer's tragic Trojan romance, Troilus and Cressida. Containing what's widely considered one of the best versions of the poem, Corpus Christi College 61 leaves ample blank space for a program of 96 images across Troilus and Cressida's 5 books. Yet, the frontispiece is the only illumination the manuscript received, and it famously depicts not a scene from the narrative, but the scene of a narration. Here, Chaucer speaks from a pulpit, declaiming his poem in open air. A highly foreshortened, densely forested ravine funnels out, warbles, scratches, and cries from behind the poet to punctuate his performance. From the opposite direction comes the rumor of a courtly audience. Some listen attentively, one or two doze off. Among them we see King Richard II, Queen Anne of Bohemia, and the king's mother, Joan of Kent. Interruptive sounds impinge here as well. Idle and flirtatious chatter at the margins of the gathered crowd hems in the poetic event. From above, the sounds of parade. Less composed or chaotic, two throngs spill towards each other from inside the castle and from outside the pictorial frame. In the distance, the sounds of the domestic life of the castle spill out windows and burst through turrets. Another procession, another forest. Chaucer stands out here, the only isolated figure in the image, framed by pulpit, rock face, and grove. He mediates natural and social. He inhabits sound's nexus. It is his speaking, his poem, that occasions the threading together of the sounds of the world into a meaningful, multiform assemblage. Notably, though, he holds no book. One wouldn't be blamed for thinking there is no book to be found here at all, unless we count the book onto which the image has been painted, which I suggest we do, because the illumination suggests we do. where every other figure in the image is garbed in blue, red, pink, green, and gold, robes of dye stuff or mineral or metal. Chaucer is plain clothed, his tunic the color of his skin, which is also the skin of the vellum. On the facing folio, the poem's first initial is inhabited by a man in profile, hybrid letter and figure, conjoint skin and skin, speaking. The double sorrow of Troilus to tell me purpose is ere that he part from him. That the narrator of the Troilus renders his utterance a performance before an assembly of listeners as early as the poem's 5th line is no accident. The illuminator has acknowledged as much and gone further with Chaucer's image, an image, which is to say a representation, one that self-consciously marks the place around and through which speaking voice circulates, which is to say a pronoun, an I, the marker of the site of an occasion for utterance. And he has gone further yet, aligning poet, narrator, I, voice, sound, the occasion for sound, the gathering of bodies into sound, with the book. Not just the book abstractly, but this book, Corpus Christi College 61, whose flesh is Chaucer's flesh, whose flesh we touch and make sonorous. The manuscript is a tape deck, the image of Chaucer its play button, and our bodies its speakers. In the prologue to Book 2, the narrator of Troilus and Clysaida dreams about me and my technology. He speaks to me about his sound, about the sounds of his words and their strangeness in my mouth, his sounds which are my sounds because of the book between us. Ye kno ek, that in form of speech is challenge within 1,000 year, and wordes though that hadden priest nu wonder nis and strange us thinketh him. And yet they spake him so, and sped as well in love as men do. Chaucer anticipates the antiquation of his English, not yet middle, and insists on its efficacy, not as words, but as spoken sounds that bring bodies together into intimate configurations. The niceness and strangeness of ancient speech is the product of our thinking it so across a historical distance. Each lufethe still quickened pulses in the project of love when it was spoken 1,000 years ago, less because of the form of the words than because of the fact of their speaking. Historical, present, and prospective sounds coincide as the narrator teases us, flirts with us, in the last stanza of the poem. Ek scarcely been there in this place a thray that han in love side leak and done in all. For to thee purpose this my leaking there, and they reach nocht, yet all is side or shall. Diachronic linguistic diversity colonizes the synchronic spread of utterance. Every speaker becomes an historical era unto himself. The language we speak to each other in this plaza is no less nice and strange than the sweet nothings of 1,000 years ago. The likelihood of misprision and misfire ever girdling the loving words we say to one another, the loving words I say to you now. What 2, let alone 3 of us have said and done the same in love to the very last act. Yet, for all the wild variety of our amorous idiolects, all is side or shall. A note of playful optimism. Every speech succeeds at the right time and under the right circumstances in the effective and affective acoustic reality of its saying. If all is side or shall, if all possible speech is ultimately efficacious in the facticity of its soundedness, ec sum en grave in tre, sum in stone wall, as it petit. For every voice, a recording. For every speech, as it happened, an inscription in durable matter. Wood, stone, vellum, vinyl, magnetic tape, hard drive. Each recording's playback generates sound that is iterative. All is side or shall. The or, linking, present perfect, and future saying, marking their interchangeable equivalency. We replay Chaucer's recitation before King Richard's court. More accurately, we replay the musicking of that recitation every time we read the Troilus, not by virtue of poet or book or voice or audience, but in the collaborative interplay of all of these that occurs when we press play on the codex machine, Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, MS 61. Still, is this music? I hope you'll agree with me that at least it can be so, as I'm defining the term, yet we could do with some melody. So I invite you again to play, now another manuscript, a different codex machine. Lincoln College, MS Latin 89. This slim utilitarian book contains a late 14th century copy of Richard Rolle's extravagant alliterative treatise, the Nellis Amoris, in which the English mystic offers his most detailed and evocative descriptions of his spiritual audition of angelic song. The text is grossly imperfect, with large gaps cancelling out half of its length. Extensive marginalia fills the leaves that remain. After this fragmentary text comes a gathering of music notation, what Anne-Marie Seaman hails as, quote, the largest known source of English polyphonic kyries of the 15th century, end quote. It contains antiphons, mass settings, carols, troped kyries, works by John Dunstable, John Plummer, and Lionel Power. These too are in fragmentary condition, some offering isolated or incomplete voice parts, some damaged beyond recovery, shades of Niels' presentation. These are the only two items the manuscript contains. When and why they were bound together remains unclear. Together, however, they form a remarkable instrument. Where I began playing Corpus Christi College 61 from the beginning, I'd like to come at Lincoln College Latin at 89 from behind, working backwards in time. We begin with the music gathering, which opens with John Dunstable's discant motet Beata Mater on a folio that was removed from its original location and deliberately placed to be the first music we meet. The motet opens with a unison on C, one sound, one voice. Soon, the voice bifurcates. Then a third voice appears, a multiplication of voices nested into and emerging out from one another. We don't know what these voices sing for a long time. It takes 5 breathes before we hear any grammatical inflection. Ta. 13 breathes before the languorous vocalese on a breaks. 10. Even when it comes clear that it is Mary of whom the singers sing, we do not yet know why. Whether for description or narration, praise or petition, we don't know until the final section of the motet. The music draws us into oral, linguistic, and discursive uncertainty, destabilizing our sense amid the lushness of Dunstable's Contenas Andoas. When the second section of the motet opens, we find ourselves better oriented. We know this sonority, unison on C. We know that 3 voices will telescope out of each other. But they don't. The third voice is missing. Chordal textures give way to counterpoint, to dialogue. We grow more destabilized. The opening phrase cadences familiarly at the octave. Then the top voice drops to an unstable 6th. And then silence. An incomplete utterance, a gap yawning wide. The music plies us with longing for resolution, for voices, for some answer to the prayer or the question that hangs in the full breathe of empty air. And the music spurns us, and it frustrates us. The sonority that follows thrusts us into an entirely different harmonic context. We are rattled, unsettled. Our ear longs for something full, and we are given fragments, errancy, silences. The illusion of oral expertise falls away through intractable gaps. Dunstable's motet teaches me how to play Lincoln College Latin 89, that fragmentary, gap-ridden instrument, how to give it my voice so it can give voices back to me. I turn back a leaf, folio 18 recto, around the year 1400. Arena reacts to Richard Rolle's mention of defenseless foundlings by recording in the margins an exemplum about a schoolboy who sings Gaude Maria Virgo as he walks the Jewish quarter, a story with which Chaucer was also familiar. The boy's dead body, its throat slit open by Jewish hands, sings again when a cantor sings the Requiem Mass in its presence. The boy is a manuscript, a mass of dead flesh, from which voice flows, when lent a voice that knows how to play it properly. I turn back further. Folio 9 recto, around 1380, as Rolle skyrockets to prominence. The devout reader construes Rolle's alliterative Latin and meditates on its lavish descriptions of the spiritual sensations of heat, sweetness, and song. I turn back further. Portfolio somewhere between 5 and 6 Lost Leaves, containing one of Rollo's most intensely alliterative passages, chapter 17, denouncing the reprobate. What is it then that I hope for? What is it I hope to give you? Music or noise? Polyphony or cacophony? If polyphony, not the heteroglossic kind that Mikhail Bakhtin hears in the novel, he is not the first literary critic to be drawn to the technical vocabularies of music, to identify features of language and rhetoric in an under-theorized manner, a vice I hope I have avoided. If I make more noise than music, I'm hopeful it's the sort of noise Jacques Attali and Daniel Halloraisen explore, a body of sound discarded from the sorting pile called music, upon which the category named music depends, from which new modes of meaningful expressive possibility so often arise. At the very least, it's the noise of a student standing the double bass upright for the first time, resting its weight awkwardly on his shoulder, no ear yet for its tuning, no technique yet for its exercise. I strike my heavy hand across the manuscript's strings. The sound is perhaps less than pleasant, but at least the instrument is out of the storage closet, shaking off some of its dust. With practice and sensitivity, through hazards and errors, I'd like to bend my ear to its accord, and I'll hope to pick out better tunes as I learn better to play, even if I play incorrectly, which I suspect I can't avoid. To be frank, I don't know that we can play manuscripts correctly. But then, this doesn't vex me as an essential problem. The correct performance is rarely the performance we love. If we reconsider our desire for correctness, for the feeling of a tidy, argued order, our scholarship might come not just to think, but to be inside the contingency of experience among the material playthings of the past. And what might we learn from abiding the motivated uncertainty of this relation? I wish to succumb to these desiring machines. I invite us to dally and play with them. I want to hear what it's like to sing duets with them, however brash and inexpert our voices may be, and to learn to hear something new. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albin. It was extremely thought-provoking, fantastic. And Björn, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here, and I thank Bruno and Peter for inviting me, and also the whole Orpheus team. It's a big honor and a big pleasure. And also, maybe just before starting, I would like to tell you a small anecdote I just thought about. In fact, it was in fact Ton Koopman who invited me into early music when I was, I think, 8 or 9 years old. My mother had this vinyl LP at home with the Christmas songs of Herman van Veen, which was in fact all arranged, you can say. It was all made into new, I think a lot of them were new, Baroqueized versions or arrangements of these old Christmas songs. And my nephew, my niece and me, we tried from this LP to transcribe the songs, the text, and also even the melodies, and we tried even to get something of the continual arrangement. We didn't succeed, but I think this, when I was 8 or 9 years old, this must have been for me a crucial moment. And so, in fact, it's wonderful to be here on this moment and to find something back of that experience. So now to something much more boring, and I'm afraid I cannot cope with the creativity of my two colleagues here. So I apologize for that. I wanted to give you some provocative ideas, but maybe it will be a disappointment, so I apologize already for that. As you can see, the title is also not anymore like in the program, but that's in the process of making a lecture. You change, in fact, everything. Well, that works. According to Wikipedia, bibliomania is, quote, a symptom of obsessive-compulsive disorder which involves collecting or even hoarding books to the point where social relations or health are damaged, end of quote. And a little bit further, quote, bibliomania is characterized by the collecting of books which have no use to the collector, nor any great intrinsic value to a genuine book collector. The purchase of multiple copies of the same book and edition, and the accumulation of books beyond possible capacity of use or enjoyment are frequent symptoms of bibliomania, end quote. Common internet psychology like this sees bibliomania as the problem and not already as the response to a preceding problem, a primordial anxiety, a response already including its proper solution. By the way, I apologize for my Belgian English. I'm ashamed of it, but, well, I cannot do better, but, so bear with me. The normal engagement with books is reduced to the utility and usefulness of books. One buys the book one needs, and the pleasure of books is connected to this good usage. There is, in this view, no engagement that goes beyond the pleasure principle. But what if, in reality, there is almost always something else at stake? What if the formal legitimations, these books help us to make us understand art and music better and how it should be performed, point in fact at an anxiety on a deeper level when we are confronted with artworks, visual and musical, their displacement, alienation, lack or loss of a meaningful world, something we heard in the stories before already, so I'm sorry to repeat, of which these artworks are even often regarded as souvenirs or fetishes, as also was said before already. Do we need books to understand art? Do we need information to know how to perform early music repertoires? Let me be clear from the start, I think we do. So, but I should add an important element. The library is in itself the creation of a world, not the archive of a lost past. It is a subjective engagement with the world, the creation of a subjective encounter with a past full of contradictions and gaps, what commonly we would call history. An encounter which makes us understand that there is no early music and that the historical other doesn't exist. A library, I think, is one possible dramaturgy of this, and a concert maybe probably another. To continue briefly this line of thought, it will be a question of where we locate the problem of our anxiety, in structural lack or in historical loss. And consequently, do we collect books to compensate the loss, or rather in order to deal with it artistically and to articulate this structural lack? Believing that early music exists means that you contemplate a historical loss. Believing that it doesn't exist is to affirm a structural lack. We need to continue collecting, not according to yet a third option, let's say the postmodern, so-called modest one, knowing we will never collect enough to bridge the gap, but in order to understand how structural lack, historically the condition of music itself, as I will try to show, is even constitutive for performance practice. Collecting books doesn't lead necessarily to better performances. I claim that as long as we believe early music exists, it will not. Not without risk, I could recall Adorno here. Remember, the one who once defended Bach against his devotees. A dangerous text. By claiming that a successful performance is necessarily the one that goes to the limit of subjectivity, while at the same time being capable of articulating the contradictions of the score. Something that Adorno repeats on and on. This element of subjectivity is somehow a problematic one in the world of early music performance and another trigger for anxiety. Let me recall that one of the legends of how early music came into being is that it reacted against a romantic attitude to music, by which is meant a purely subjectively decided and commonsensical approach without any historical guarantee of truth. But instead of seeing its own critical potential as subjective, in the sense of a rupture with the given tradition of performance practice, taken for granted, this attitude equally substantializes the past and imagines a sort of historical big other, which guarantees a performance by the book.
So my talk would like to open a rethinking of the notion of subject and subjectivity, not as commonsensically closed in itself, but that what is constituted in and through art practice. The subjective as that what causes a rupture inside the artwork, splitting it, or the articulation of contradiction in performance, that what makes it exactly, I think, into an artwork. But let's get more concrete now, because we had already a lot of speculation, and start with recalling a paradigmatic, be it also complex and contradictory library or book collection, the one of Abi Warburg, a private collection at first. That's Abi. A semi-private and para-academic afterwards, and finally it became a purely academic library. Abi Warburg, the Jewish-German art historian of Hamburg, who died in 1929, is an intriguing figure and receives more and more popularity today due to his ambiguous and contradictory intellectual directions and endeavors. At his death, he left behind two major, but of course unfinished or ongoing projects. The first one is the Mnemosyne Bilder Atlas, which you see here as a kind of first attempt to expose it. And then, of course, his legendary Warburg Library. This is a photo from the Hamburg house, which would move to London in 1933 with the rise of Nazism in Germany in order to save the library. Why recalling an art historical library when we are gathered here around a book collection in line with early music performance? The German musicologist Laurens Lüteken once complained that the study of music history lacks someone like Abi Warburg, a complex, ambiguous father figure for art history and iconology, as much admired as reviled. Developing a semi-conceptual apparatus, Warburg considered his research as the first step for the foundation of a real Kulturwissenschaft, including all arts, also music, and his art historical method, although almost never applied to historical music today, seems to offer really interesting new perspectives here. Even more concrete, I'm convinced that in the context of this conference, focusing on Warburg's library and his particular way of collecting and organizing books could be extremely relevant. I'm not used to this PowerPoint. I'm always afraid to push the wrong button, but okay. In a memoir added to Ernst Gombrich's authoritative Warburg biography of 1970, focusing specifically on the history of the library, Fritz Zaxel, Warburg's late assistant who also would organize the transfer of the library to London afterwards, explains how the idea of a private library came about. The trigger for Warburg was his confrontation as a student with the two mythological masterpieces by Botticelli. I don't have a picture of that, but the Primavera and the Venus, all known, they are popular culture nowadays. A formal analysis after the encounter with the mystery or enigma of these artworks made him uneasy, but the idea of a purely historical contextual description equally unsatisfied him. The only place of departure, he imagined, was a kind of hybrid collection. Interdisciplinarity, so often praised today, was here not the result of a kind of actor network theory avant la lettre or culturalist historicist pragmatics, but caused by an anxiety being confronted with the impossible closure of an artwork and the maybe desperate attempt to circumvent this void in the artwork, without domesticating its primordial, ambiguous attraction. And now comes a quote from Zaxel, from the memoir. Quote, Warburg, in his burning desire to unriddle the mystery of the pictures, went from one of these seminar libraries to another, pursuing his clues from art to from religion to literature, from literature to philosophy. To give the student a library uniting the various branches of the history of human civilization, where he could wander from shelf to shelf, was his resolve. By the way, this is Zaxel's reinterpretation of what Warburg was, of course, intended to do. The government, this is quite funny what comes now, I put it just because maybe it brings us to, the government would, in his opinion, never be willing to create such an instrument. The initiative must come from the private sector, and he persuaded his family to accept financial responsibility for this novel and costly enterprise, end quote. However, an interdisciplinary collecting of the right books was not what Warburg had in mind. Instead of creating a stable organizing library principle, Warburg wanted to inject in the endeavor the alienating encounter with the artwork itself and transpose this to the encounter with the collection. This alienating encounter we could also call the subjective encounter, in the sense that the artwork subjectifies itself to two major Warburgian concepts. And some of you probably know them. The first one is what he called the Nachleben, or afterlife of artworks, and secondly, the pathos formal or formula. So the first one, the Nachleben, points at the intrinsic displacement of artworks, of their fundamental anachronism and alienation exceeding the time of their origin, not only towards the future, but also as a rupture with the symbolic order in which they emerge. The latter, the pathos formula, points at the intrinsic alien element in the artwork, the thing that doesn't seem to belong, coming from another place, nevertheless being completely immersed in the whole of the artwork, making it impossible to close the artwork as a totality. Warburg tried to capture and categorize, or should we also say here, domesticate these pathos formulas. One example, and this is from the Atlas, it's the plate called Nympha. So the figure of the Nympha, which is one of his most paradigmatic pathos formulas, which he, of course, encountered for the first time when he was staying in Firenze, the frescoes of Ghirlandaio. And then, of course, you see the pathos formula is the Nympha who enters a quite orthodox, let's say, late medieval setting, and this moving figure breaks, in fact, into the doxa of the image. The principle by which the library regulated this anxiety with the alien element, and which is also its impulse and conditio sine qua non, Warburg called das Gesetz der guten Nachbarschaft, the law of the good neighbor or neighborliness. Between brackets, Gute Nachbarschaft can be understood ironically, revealing its connection with the anxiety caused by the alien thing, the neighbor, let's say, inside, but out of place, similar to the way in which Warburg changed the known expression, the devil is in the detail, into his preferred, the good God is in the detail. You have to get to the humor of Warburg, but okay. Let me quote again some crucial passages from the memoir of Saxel, first about the disquieting shuffling and reshuffling of books by Warburg. Quote, the arrangement of the books was equally baffling, and the visitor may have found it most peculiar, perhaps, that Warburg never tired of shifting and reshifting them. Maybe we could start already to bring this in practice. Every progress in his system of thought, every new idea about the interrelation of facts made him regroup the corresponding books. The library changed with every change in his research method and with every variation in his interests. Small as the collection was, it was intensely alive, and Warburg never ceased shaping it so that it might best express his ideas about the history of man. And quote, you feel also a little bit this, maybe a little bit expired tone of still universal history and so on and so forth. The law of the good neighbor was a way of ordering or categorizing without domesticating the fundamental encounter of what comes from the outside. Still another quote, sorry for this boring. I hope I don't have these double. Saxel is, unfortunately, we don't have the voice of Saxel, so I cannot do this, this doubling of the voice, unfortunately. So, another quote. Most libraries, even those which allowed the student open access, as for instance Cambridge University Library, had to make concessions to the machine age which increased book production from day to day and to give up grouping the books in a strictly systematic order. The book title in the file catalogue replaced, in most cases, that other and much more scholarly familiarity which is gained by browsing. Warburg recognized this danger. He spoke of the law of the good neighbor. The book of which one knew was in most cases not the book which one needed. The unknown neighbor on the shelf contained the vital information, although from its title one might not have guessed this. The overriding idea was that the books together, each containing its larger or smaller bits of information and being supplemented by its neighbors, should, by their titles, guide the student to perceive the essential forces of the human mind and its history. You get the tone of Zaxel also there, of always this human mind and history. Books were for Warburg more than instruments of research. Assembled and grouped, they expressed the thought of mankind in its constant and its changing aspects. End quote. The law of the good neighbor transposes to the book collection the idea of an intrusive staying right next to what you were focusing on or heading to. This is the opposite of a nice, creative, interdisciplinary juxtaposition of books explaining you the marvels of art. What Warburg stages here, and it is indeed a dialectical theatralization, is the appearance of the crucial divided or split subjectivity in all art research, something that is inside, yet seemingly coming from the outside, attracting you in all its alienating ambiguity, forcing you to change your path of investigation and its content, engaging with the subjectivity of an artwork. Beware, next to the book you need and want to read, which you thought indispensable for a balanced and harmonious study, is another book, The Good Neighbor. We start to feel the Warburgian irony here, which will destroy forever the trust and security you had in finding your answers in the book of your first choice. So the library was not only personally linked to Warburg because of his personal choices, but these choices connected not so much to what he thought he needed, but more to handle his own anxiety, confronted with the fundamental dislocation or displacement of and inside artworks, were also played out inside the library and became rather a real obstacle for the further academization of the collection, as Zaxel explains on several places. However, the fundamental question is, if the subject emerging out of the collection is Warburg's idiosyncratic subject, or is it that Warburg's intuition gives way for the dramaturgy of subjectivity as an unavoidable principle of research of artworks? Of course, for Zaxel, the only way to disclose the library for academic use was to normalize the system, in fact, disavowing its fundamental connection to anxiety. Two quotes again. The responsibility was heavy, he says. What the library was, it had become to Warburg's genius. Every book had been selected by him. The systematic arrangement was his. The contacts with a wide circle of scholars. The problem was to develop the heritage of an absent master and friend, and to develop it without his guidance into something new. End of quote. By the way, that was the moment in 1920 when Warburg was taken up in a psychiatric asylum and left the library in his, let's say, crazy state, according to the pupils and the colleagues. Second quote. In every corner of the library, there were small groups of books indicating a special trend of thought. It was just this extreme wealth of ideas which, on the one hand, made it the delight of the scholar, but on the other hand, made it difficult for him to find his way about. Now comes something funny. When Professor Cassirer, that's the big Ernst Cassirer, you know, the philosopher, first came to see the library, he decided either to flee from it, which he did for some time, or to remain there a prisoner for years, which for a certain period he enjoyed doing in later years. Warburg's new acquisitions had, of course, always an inner coherence, but there were many tentative and personal excrescences which might be undesirable in an institution destined for a wider public. End of quote. And then still some more quotes. I'm so sorry for this, to bother you with this, but this is interesting because it shows this process, slow process in the mind of Zaxel and his colleagues of normalization and stabilization. The first quote, the first and most urgent task is in stabilizing the library seemed therefore to normalize Warburg's system, as it was in 1920, by enlarging it here, cutting it down there. So you see these operations of, well, domestication. Second quote, which is a little bit later in the text, the second point, he repeats it, was to normalize the contents of the library. No single person's learning and interests, not even Warburg's, he says, are as wide as those of a group of anonymous users of a collection, and their wishes are certainly legitimate. In 1920, the library possessed perhaps about 20,000 volumes. Certain parts were almost fully developed, others just begun, thanks to the fact that the funds came partly from members of the family living in the USA and that there was inflation in Germany. We were in a position to continue buying books and to take care, and this is very interesting, that gaps should be filled. Gaps should be filled. End of quote. No surprise then that Warburg finally recovered from a serious psychic breakdown that made him the patient of a psychic asylum for almost 4 years. After the normalization of his library, when he came back by his assistants and pupils, would engage immediately with the new similar project qua Touch, I mean the Warburg Touch. His infamous and never finished Bilderatlas, Mnemosyne, exploring the dialectics of images. By the way, it's exactly this dialectical relation between images or books which is completely absent from postmodern or neoliberal digital image collections such as the Google image collection you have on your computer or on the web. This dialectics is, however, I think it's really crucial, I think, an intrinsic part of Warburg's method and quasi-concepts. The gaps resulting from this dialectical relation between the books, making it different from an institutional library and resulting in the so-called openness or incompleteness of the collection, are not to be filled as Zaxel did, because they are constitutive of the fundamental conception of his approach. Zaxel gave this openness or incompleteness through his transformation a postmodern twist avant la lettre. The openness of the collection is not anymore a radical, fundamental openness, but a pragmatic one, meaning that it would be just humanly, physically impossible to collect all the books needed in order to get full understanding or knowledge. In his view, there is a neutral juxtaposition of all particular books, equally important. It would be just a question of collecting long enough to get slowly to the truth. The idea here is that the more we collect, the more we gain and know, the more we inform ourselves, the more we accumulate knowledge and information, the more our picture of the past gains veracity, and the context or background of the artworks gives us access to the artworks themselves. It is clear that this accumulative logic is completely at odds with the approach of Warburg. In a way, the attitude of Warburg resonates well with the Renaissance concept of the non finito. This is to spice it up now after all these, at least some pictures now. No? Okay. And sorry, there is not so much talk about music, but I hope you somehow see the resonance. The non finito concept, a visual artwork, but why not extend it to the performance of a musical work? And we got this suggestion also already 2 times before. Why not expanding this to performance of musical works? So a visual artwork is basically engaging in a fundamental incompleteness and openness. Was, according to Freud and many others, one of the most important features of Leonardo's art and artistic approach not his procrastination? Maybe you could say the clinical contrapposto or double of sprezzatura. It seems to be the same for Warburg as a writer and researcher. There is something so fundamentally unfinished, lacking or leaking in artworks of the past that it is impossible not to get contaminated by this aspect in one's own approach towards these same works. And maybe I could also recall a very interesting one. So there is a Dr. Heinrich Emden, who was one of the doctors that treated Warburg in his crisis. And he talks about Warburg's deadline anxiety or Terminangst, something many of us could probably share. And there is a beautiful book. It's called Die Unendliche Heilung, where all this is explained. The whole stay in the Kreuzlingen psychiatric clinic. It's really worth to go to that book. I think, but no time. Unfortunately, I have to continue. I will try to go fast. Of course, here the trigger for is it okay? Of course, here the trigger for this exceptional book collection or library here, where we are gathered, emerges not primarily from a personal and passionate attachment to images, but to musical repertoires from a quite distant past. what could be the past and future of such a collection if we don't want to normalize or neutralize it, if we basically recognize that early music doesn't exist? Music has its proper problems and difficulties, and there is a complex and intriguing complicity of staging or performing musical works and experiencing them. The modern performer is not just the medium of the musical work, but in a way essentially part of it and completely complicit in it, something we got to hear also before. The basic anxiety provoked by the floating, alienating, anachronistic character of images, what Warburg called their afterlife and inner pathos formulas, to use once more his quasi-categories, is not the whole story, what music is concerned. There is a further complication, namely the impossibility of the performer not to be biased, not being all too subjectively involved in the presentation or perception of the musical work. And this bias is probably even more articulated the more one tries to reduce or minimalize the personal involvement. The fantasy of the performer just as a medium or instrument of the composition or the intention of the composer, you know, all these cliches. Again, Adorno seems to be pointing here at something when he claimed that true universality in music interpretation is only guaranteed by a maximal subjectivation in performance. We could discuss this after. Believing in the existence of early music is basically admitting, I fear or I think, the fundamental role of this anxiety through its repression and the minimalization, circumvention or blunt disavowal of the inclusion of the artist or performer. But how to engage with these contradictions? Maybe the problem with the traditional historicism is not that it goes too far, but that it in the end doesn't go far enough. So could we think of a sort of weird radical historicism helping us here? One that recognizes historically split or divided performers and an equally contradictory musical art transmitted and negotiated, we heard that word already many times, these negotiations, through libraries, equally divided and I think dialectical. There is no time to develop this in detail here, but let me conclude with 3 possible examples, which are a little bit random, I apologize for that, but okay. Let's go first to Leonardo da Vinci, his idea of paragone and connected with musical anxiety. Second, I will talk very briefly about ornamentation, and then third, but we have no time probably for that, there is a beautiful image that I wanted to show you as a sort of allegory for all this, that's the mystic wine press, or what I would call monstrous performance of squeezed out scores. What that means, I will talk to tell you later. Just, you could think in the religious theological idea of incarnation, the idea of, okay. First, Leonardo. Leonardo da Vinci explores in his notes, which lay the groundwork for the so-called paragone, the investigation of good neighborliness in the different, between the different arts, the similarities and differences of painting and music. This is, the Winternitz book is maybe also in the library, I don't know, the books where Leonardo talks about, specifically about music. Both music and painting create images, although he contradicts that in some notes, but in one he says it clearly, both create images, paintings and music, be it visible or invisible, in the case of music. Both have a simultaneity, at least with polyphony. But in the end, for Leonardo, it is painting that has an enduring and permanent status, while music, as he famously states, dies while being born. Alluding, of course, to the physical observation that music is necessarily continuous repetition. I think we had that also in your this idea of the repetition compulsion almost intrinsically in music. So it's continuous repetition and continuous emerging and fading away of the very material itself. And so music has to continuously produce in order to go on. You feel already this almost basic anxiety that we, of course, we disavow, we don't talk about, but it is basically in music there, and Leonardo saw that very clearly. So music has to continuously produce in order to go on, because it dies out on the same moment it is produced. Very interesting because it's a quite physical experience in a way. It's like, and Leonardo had a touch for that. Of course, we know that. With this statement, Leonardo affirms how much Warburg's idea of art is phenomenologically most near to music in its intrinsic instability, and Nachleben, afterlife, as a physical condition. Our counter-argument could be that Leonardo sees in this exactly the failures of music in favor of the permanence and endurance of painting. But the complexity and dialectics of his statement, based on an equally fundamental anxiety of his own art and art in general, becomes fully clear in the light of the approach to his own painting. Leonardo, and this is one of the most famous examples, Leonardo was well known as emblematic procrastinator, just like Warburg, leaving most works half-finished, giving way to the later Renaissance ideal of the non finito artwork. We could say, referring to Walter Pater, that for Leonardo, his disavowed ideal was that all art aspires to the condition of music. Thanks to Leonardo's disavowal, we get to see how much Warburg's approach would resonate with collecting books in the light of the performance of early music repertoires. The problem with these repertoires is that they are like Fremdkörper in our own time. Repeated already before, like what Adorno would have called messages in a bottle, and that was a kind of cherished image of him. Early music tries to recreate or reinvent a world for these musical works, so-called with the aim to come to better insights of how to perform these works adequately. Of course, there is, I think, also a traumatic element here. Musical works of the past are somehow lost. We can never hear them as they sounded, only in a kind of surrogate or ruined form. But this idea does not take into account the structural, physical loss of music itself, its repetitive character as condition for its existence. Loss is part of music itself, it's performed loss. This aspect of loss functions as a sort of archi-pathos formula, you could say, giving rise to all kind of different variations of more specific pathos formulas, some of which can only be articulated in the performance, such as ornamentation, for example. Historically informed performance doesn't accept the traditional performance of these repertoires based on transgenerational tradition, the romantic tradition, and common sense or just subjective taste. I said that already. There is an almost postmodern death of the composer element playing here, and death of the pre-modern artwork. Artworks don't exist in the pre-modern and so on. And the favored idea of the full historical identification with musical works and practices and the symbolic culture out of which they emerge. But instead of engaging with this fundamental loss, historically informed performance disavows it and believes that a partial return to the original is somehow a possible perspective. In this view, structural lack becomes historical loss. Okay, then second, I have this nice non finito painting by, not an Italian painter, but by Jan van Eyck, that ruins book collections and book collections as vestigia or disiecta membra and so on are not romantic images, but fundamental for art going back to at least the 12th, 13th century, and often referring to examples from antiquity, is also clear in the art of ornamentation. I have to be, unfortunately, very brief and very general here. And ornamentation, well, okay, I will come to that. At the same time, it is a constant element of anxiety, ornamentation, moralization and normalization. And people who know the sources know what I'm talking about. It's intriguing that ornamentation is mostly seen as a way of adding things to a prefabricated musical structure or substance, while in fact physically it is a changing of the very material itself. It is in fact a taking away, a sculpting or hollowing out of it. And well, there is a very nice notion by Doni when he talks about plasma, referring to antiquity. But then also, of course, in Gothic towers, you have very clearly this idea, and for sure also in the one that Van Eyck was painting here. By the way, and that's very interesting also, you see that Van Eyck paints a tower in construction or decay, it's like looks the same. So a non-finito tower, but his work itself is also a non-finito work. So you can say form and content are in fact doubled here, and that's absolutely, I think, crucial. So in the same way, a Gothic tower presents its own dematerializing tendency, its proper, you can say, becoming void. That idea of stone carved out, and you get, in fact, like in music, you take away, in fact. Although in our language we say we add with ornamentation. So there is a sort of fundamental negativity in ornamentation, you can say, in a conceptual way. What I want to say is that the topic of ornamentation is again basically linked to the anxiety of what music is in essence and what can be done with it. A performer now and back in the time has to relate to or subjectively engage with this. Ornamentation is in fact the art of articulating, emphasizing, working out, bending, stretching, slowing down, music's essential character of disappearing. Ornamentation is always related to the fragile material of music itself, to its uncertain state, its infinite ending or continuous decay. Ornaments are endless endings. So it tackles directly the recognition that music is lost in itself, and early music seems not to find so easily another approach than maybe a fetishistic denial of this loss in an overcompensating actual performance. By making this loss historical, they seem to think some performance of early music, it could be triumphantly recuperated. Or in the other way, in a false modesty or frustration that no actual performance can ever realize the lost origin. I'm almost finished, so I had still a quote from Zenobi, but because it's also very interesting dialectical. He talks about simple style, simple singing, canto schietto, where he says, of course, it's all with, so he says, canto schietto, simple form, it's of course without any passaggio, but only with grace, trillo, tremolo, ondeggiamento, and esclamazione. Just to say how complex and dialectical interwoven these notions are. Both attitudes that I described before would see in the library the instrument to compensate for the lack or gaps in the musical performative knowledge. Here too, the basic common sense idea is that accumulating more knowledge could lead to a better or more adequate performance practice, or at least give us disillusion. But it has to deny our personal involvement in reconstructing this image of the past, and it has to affirm a substantiality of the past, as if it is an undivided world to which books in the collection participate in an immediate and completely identifiable way. I come to the third point that I will just, so that's the mystical wine press what I'm talking about. I do a lecture in the Berlok, maybe they will film it and I can talk about that another time. So it's just to say that theology is very interesting because it shows also in Baroque images this idea of a squeezed out Christ, what they call in theology kenosis, and which moves from substance to subject, in fact, as Hegel would say. So you get, in fact, in theology of the time, this idea of subjectivity, which is remarkable, I think, because we think of theology as something from another realm. So to conclude now, finally, in an attempt to define something of this alternative approach, what could be the aim or function of the library after the recognition that early music doesn't exist, which means we stopped creating a phantasmatic historical order supposed to know. Historical sources or whatever from the past can never be positively inscribed as just additional parts of historically affirmative totality. We can never just apply them as if they are descriptive testimonies of what happened. This would be completely deny their dialectical inscription as Warburg intuitively recognized. Historical books and sources are basically, first of all, I think, hieroglyphic. It means they are just as enigmatic for us as for the historical people producing them and self-mirroring in them. They are, secondly, diagrammatic, neither prescriptive nor descriptive. Our engagement with them is, as Benjamin said, quoting Hofmannsthal, and I had to say that because it was the title of my lecture, so to read what was never written. And finally, 3, they are symptomatic. Books are like symptoms or good neighbors. They appear as an event, an intrusion in the common sense notion of culture and history, but their real meaning is always elusive. They are the counterpart of illustrative symbols. I imagine this library, this one, as a necessarily allegorical machine. Machines are fascinating us, apparently. Allegorical machine helping us to deal with the past and to perform music from the past as unseen, never seen lights flashing up, to use Walter Benjamin's metaphor in his indispensable thesis on the concept of history. A light flashing up for a very brief moment in time. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Björn, will you come please to the chairs?
one glass more.
So, I'm sure there are a lot of questions or comments, observations. From my perspective, what I understand in Niels' talk, this idea of revival of skills beyond text, beyond more textuality, but this expanded equation in the presence of context. I also stressed, like your idea of the meta text, creating a context both within the musical works, how you fulfill those empty slots, but also how you bring pieces together, the good neighbors. It's already implied there how this profoundly changes how you perceive the given piece. So I saw a connection between your talk and Warburg's ideas. And Andrew also explicitly mentioned how to become skilled. So this seems to be a continuum in all the three presentations. The question of being skilled, de-skilled, how to create new skills in the historical moment where we are, and it's always evolving. I also like your double reading, because that makes very evident the granularity, the graindelavoix, very clearly, and how intangible it is to try to reconstruct any possible meaning, not to speak from the sound, of any body producing music or noise or whatever it is. And this granularity was very inspiring also to really, as you enacted it. It was a fantastic moment. And your last point, in my view, was this, that songs lean forward. So some future somewhere. They will have the afterlife, the Nachtleben, very clearly. And in the afterlife, Warburg talks about the artworks, but also about very limited formal inside it, like a bird, a flower, a plant, a gesture. All this comes from Babylonian times until today, how this is persisting and is trying to stay alive. So for me, this idea was wonderful, and in a way, the general idea of contamination that you also Björn mentioned very well. This also prevents all your talks. So there is no clean solution for anything. It's all contaminated. So these are just my three observations about your talks. I would like to open the floor for specific questions, if there are, or if you have some comments yourself, the three of you. So there is one question. I cannot see the name, I'm sorry. Present yourself.
Alexandra Fistel, Music University. I would have a question for the first presenter. You were talking about reconstruction to be faithful to the style, which is for me also very interesting, and I think it's the direction in which you go. If we had a piece which had originally 4 voices, a motet of 4 voices, and there is 1 voice missing, we can say a reconstruction is possible. If we have just 2 voices and 2 are missing, it's a bit more complicated, but it's still doable. If there is just 1 voice, what we have, and all 3 voices are missing, is it still, when we try to reconstruct, is it still a reconstruction or a composition, and how is it still possible to stay in this style or to be faithful to a style, trying to reconstruct or compose such piece? What do you think?
Yes, so thank you very much for this interesting question. It's a part that I sacrificed, actually, of my written text, is medieval musicologists are generally a bit skeptical where it concerns the reconstruction of pieces of which there is only 1 part surviving, maybe 2 out of 3 or 4. It depends a bit also on the nature of the part. If you have, for instance, a Renaissance imitative motet, you could very well reconstruct the whole 4-voice opening if you have just 1 part. It's a bit like what I was doing. Of course, the composers wish to have done something completely different, but you will have a vital hypothesis. So what I think is actually important to distinguish the reasons why you are reconstructing. If you are reconstructing because you want your hypothesis to be 100% watertight, I think you're in the wrong business. If you wish to propose hypotheses, and here we're still very much in a text critical scholarly realm, to propose hypotheses, to further a scholarly discussion about the possibilities of the lost original, you can propose hypotheses. I'm currently working on songs by Johannes Ciconia. We have only one part. I still think that we can guess in some places. We can propose valid scholarly hypotheses as to what some passages would have looked like. The other sense also is that it is giving a life back to music which otherwise is silent. So this is also a consideration. I think it's very important, and of course this is why I borrowed these two terms from Aquinas, which is of course also a great favorite of Ecos, is that we can understand also other senses of texts than is literal text. So the texts also have feel, texts also have a metaphorical meaning, texts have a global shape. So sometimes we can get to those, if not to the literal node at a certain point. I think these are still worthwhile efforts. And of course, there is still the enormously huge lacuna of then how the text would have gone into sound, or what it matters to us as modern performers.
Also, John.
Well, just picking up on what you're saying, I mean, there's always the argument that what you're doing is reconstructing a practice which of course is gone. The singing practice of the medieval era, we can't go and hear it anymore. But I like the fact that in a way you're reconstructing that. And once you start to sing it, then you also have something else to work with. You know, you can go and sing it in the acoustic, or a similar acoustic where the text would presumably come from, and find out, you know, this could also influence further reconstructions of your text. So in fact, it's a reconstruction not of just of the text, but also of the practice of music that goes with it.
Yeah, and I think for me they're very much interlinked. So my skills in learning to compose in the historical style, they come really first from learning to improvise. So that was the topic of my doctorate. So
but does this come up as a problem of, oh, but this is you, this is not it? Because I sense that we're kind of negotiating a line between what is accepted, what's not accepted. I mean, this is
to me, it doesn't really. It depends on the person you ask whether this is accepted and in what forum you're presenting it. So on a CD, I am perfectly comfortable with presenting reconstructed works. Because in the case, maybe this is something also I skipped over, of the Dutch fragments. We had about 8 pieces in Dutch from around 1400. 8 in the entire language. Out of these, about 3 are more or less complete. 2 or 3 of them are a tiny snippet. The saddest case is a snippet from Utrecht, which literally says, "Ik beginne mijn liedekien wel." I start my song. And then is that. So there is a sense of enormous. There is a sense of loss and tragedy. English 14th century music is the same situation. There is a sense of the enormity of the tragic loss of these traditions of song, and I think it's a valid motivation to be inspired by that, to propose reconstructions as a way of salvaging or reasserting the importance of these song traditions within a global listening experience of medieval music, or even a scholarly experience, because these things often go hand in hand. If something is never performed, young scholars are not going to notice it very much, or it's going to be seen as irrelevant by grant givers. This is the famous Dieter Wilkinson connection between performance practice and scholarship. We need to take care of that too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation that's emerging, it's interesting to think about how the questions that we ask around reconstructed performance or recomposed performance, where my mind moves is, to what extent are these questions that are important to us? To what extent are these questions that would have been important to medieval performers, to medieval musicians, to medieval audiences, right? So if we think about medieval music making practices, the extent to which they relied upon notation as an authoritative source from which to perform and through which to learn, the status of the score for medieval musicians is very different than it is for us. The status of a tune and the life of a tune is very different. In the same way that when we think about Zoomtorian mouvance, right? When we think about the status of the text, we're not really thinking about urtext in the modern sense when we're dealing with medieval materials, right? The text itself is this kind of very fluid, very situational, very contingent thing. And so the questions that we ask of, is it the thing itself, right? Or is it your interpretation of the thing or your performance of the thing? That's a question that we care about. But part of what I found really interesting when you sort of engage with questions of practice and sort of historicize practice is to sort of move away from those questions as meaningful questions. There's a way in which I think, and this for me sort of connects into this idea of sort of reverse engineering medieval materials, of playing the games of medieval materials, using the materials that survive to teach us what the rules of those games are, right? That helps us move away from some of these questions which might be meaningful to us and to the categories and sort of styles of knowledge making that we are invested in now in the 20th, 21st century. But perhaps we're not of interest to people during the period when these musics were getting performed. And I think there's neat stuff that can happen when we allow for historical moments to teach us how to ask questions, but also how to theorize, right? Like there's a manner in which medieval materials are, if not explicit in the form that we anticipate theory to express itself based on how theory has unfolded in a contemporary scholarly idiom. Medieval materials aren't going to express their theory in those terms. We can look to scholastic texts and there might be some work there that resembles our modern theory, but that's not the only place where theoretical thinking happens, right? Theoretical thinking also happens in intensely pragmatic spaces. When we look at Lionel Power's treatises on improvisation and how to realize Fordham on a single line melody, that's theoretical work, even though it's intensely pragmatic. And so I think by looking and learning to sort of read what seem to be non-theoretical or non-intellectual materials and to approach them as invested in a deeply intellectual and theoretical work, there are ways in which those materials can teach us how to think, how to perform, how to even build an aesthetic sense, how to build an aesthetic style that might push back at some of our contemporary, not compulsions, but sort of presumptions about what the thing itself is, about what music is, about what the work is.
I just add one thing to add to that, is the reflection on what the locus communis is. So in the Leiden fragments, for instance, there are 3 pieces which contain little phrases that is called een vriendelijk aanzien. So this is a friendly face, a friendly expression. This is something that's used in pieces by 2 different named composers and 1 anonymous one. This was a common place of the style, and in the same way we see that composition techniques are also shared between composer X, Y, and Mr. Anonymous. So these things, they are not the property of that particular person, they are the property of a community, and they would have been the property of a community of listeners too. And I think that is the vital thing to realize about what these materials can tell us. So often also in Trecento songs you have 2 wildly different versions, one with a lot of ornaments added and one without. So which is the word text? It's a valid question to ask. The work is apparently open enough for it to be called Fior Gentile in 2 different manuscripts by the same composer, with having a radically different shape. And I think that is the important reflection on this idea of what can we do when we reconstruct. If we really insert ourselves into that ancient practice, we have a lot of freedom. Remain all the time remaining within these constraints, but we within these we have an enormous playing field.
I totally agree. I think this relates to Björn's point on displacement and alienation, because that's what you're talking about. We are dealing with objects that appear to us very displaced or in other places that we did not expect. They are alienated from their original meaning or position in art and society. And now we are talking today about different techniques of reappropriation.
But maybe one complication is that I find still a sort of commonsensical idea in historically informed performance is the idea that people were identifying with the sources we have. I think so alienation is not only that we are alienated from these old practices, but you can almost imagine that the people themselves were also alienated from them. It's like we also don't know how contemporary music works, so to say. We have no idea. I mean, we will, our children or whatever, the generations later will reflect on, it's a basic, the idea of nachträglichkeit, belated, the fact that you need always a view from the outside. So we imagine, and that's for me a very basic, really problematic aspect, is that we all the time substantialize the historical other. We say that this person who writes a treatise knows exactly what he writes, and that he writes it for a very clear reason and so on. We know when we write books, we don't know what we are writing. It's only afterwards when we reflect on them that we see what we were actually writing. And so for me, if this horizon is not changing, that's what I try to do, we still stay in that thing, are we allowed to do it, are we not allowed to? And it is because we substantialize an imagined historical other, which we give all credit, in fact. Credit of knowledge, credit of being himself or herself, like being identifying with all this material, and I cannot agree with that. So for me, this is almost an ontological problem there.
Yes.
I don't know if
You remember me of the famous Foucault quote when he says he only writes books at the border of his knowledge. And it's in this, it is exactly what you are saying. Yeah.
There's something there too about the sets of fantasies and desires that shape our compulsion to imagine that is that competent historical other, right? The sort of imagination of the historical audience that is the ideal listener, and that our desire in reconstructing the early music is to reproduce in ourselves the experience of that ideal historical listener. So as you're saying, right, there's this assumption that all historical listeners were ideally educated, had the right sort of set of listening experiences in their history, and were able to intelligize, like to sort of take in the music performance in all of its richness and all of its capacity. And like, no, right? Like audiences then were as varied and as multiply sort of deficient and able in their listening capacities as we are. And so this whole question of meaning making and its relationship to sort of perceptual experience, to the audition of music, is it's much more complex than I think we often give it credit to.
Could I give one example of this? For example, imagine the Messe de Notre Dame of Machaut. In fact, in this, let's say, more historically informed idea, we can only approach this music with the idea that the singers who were singing this music in Reims Cathedral in end of the 14th century, whatever, were fully aware of all these complexities and ideas, the novelties of this music of Machaut. But we don't know anything about it. We don't know if they maybe were completely baffled, maybe they were refusing to sing it. Maybe they would think Machaut is crazy even. This is never thought about that. Maybe, and so of course then the idea of a pre-modern artwork fits in there, because Machaut's Mass is not yet a real artwork. But I would say almost to claim, it is, because it cuts in a way with traditional Orthodox communal way of singing. If you see the daily music they were singing and you compare that with Machaut's Mass, well, there is a huge difference. It's something that there is a crack there. I would say there is a gap also there. And what is the jump made there? So you can almost say, in order to know what the gap is, of course you need to continue historic research. You need to see, but then you have to see how, for example, also authors, Chaucer and so on, how they, in fact, twist. Twist the tradition. I love this idea that also great artists, and that I would almost claim a universality here, always twist traditions, and they are not stuck into the tradition, or they are not illustrating the tradition. I don't know. Well,
there is a category of the unforeseeable input is missing, of course. It's not, even if you talk about statistical likeliness of something, you can choose the most statistically likely option, but the author may have done something, have gone off-road and have done something.
But they go fundamentally off-road. My point is, they are fundamentally. It's not like they go by accident off-road. I think why do we find this music great? Because something let's say, almost universal is still talking to us, and this means it cuts off from something we would not understand. And I would even dare to go further that maybe there is something that even in its own time was not really understood. I mean, if you read Bach's, maybe you could even put Bach's complaints about whatever he tried to do. You feel that he's on the edge of making music that could it be played, could it not be played. It's a good composer, I think, always, and a good artist is going on the fringes, on the limits of his capacities.
There's an element going against your own time, go against your own.
I would there.
That's
Yes, but yeah.
I'm totally with you.
Yeah.
But not everybody.
Then there's the question: who is a great composer?
Yeah,
Who gets
yeah.
to decide that?
I mean, I'm curious about the ways in which certain forms of reification float inside this, right? That the idea of the work of art being something that we can objectively notice as like a great work of art, as the thing that sort of torques or twists or breaks. And I think there's something interesting about the styles of thinking and the styles of canon making that are interested in distinguishing the sort of value of the artwork, right? Of distinguishing good art or important art from schlock, right? But at the same time, those questions are always in some ways determined by the person who is listening, by the encounter of an audience or a set of listeners with a set of materials, right? So there's, at the same time that we can talk about what characterizes the work as characterizing it as artful, that determination is not itself a kind of reifiable objective thing. It's always connected to a particular listener and a particularly situated listener. This is why, I don't know, I mean, the recuperation of women composers, right? Who, when sort of historical tastes for a long period of time looked at the music and sort of dismissed it as lesser than. And all of a sudden, when we start to reopen our ears and attend that music newly, all of a sudden we hear brilliantly interesting new things happening in it. But because we've we've learned to listen to it differently. We have a different set of subjectivities that are coming at the archive, right? And this is sort of Foucault's point about the archive, right? That every time the scholar walks into the archive, they're transforming the archive. And it's through the encounter of the scholar with the archive itself makes meaning. The meaning isn't inherent somehow ontologically inside the materials in the archive. It's the moment of encounter that makes the meaning happen. So it's one of these things that I think is sort of, it shapes the way that we think about both the artistic productions that we make and the scholarly productions that we make. The sort of desire for verifiability and objectivity gets back to the question of the location of subjectivization, right? Where does the subjective enter into the qualities of the work that we produce? And why is it that when we produce scholarship, when we engage in reconstruction, the problem of subjectivity is a problem, right? What makes the entrance of the subjective into the work that we do itself a problem, and what kinds of desires or fantasies sit around the fetishization of objectivity? That seems like a...
I think you're addressing a lot of problems that will be solved in the next 2 days. It's very good. That's very good. It's a good bridge for other topics. Subjectivity is for sure a very crucial problem for music making. So I think for the sake of time, we have to close the session now here. I think there is lunch. But
lunch in the main building, corridor 12, which is outside to the left.
Thank you for